I'm Marilyn Priel with The Better Part. We've done a number of programs recently about Eastern Europeans and Americans' experiences during World War II. Our guest today was a little German boy, a refugee during that same time. Stay tuned to hear about that experience and much more.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program by and for seniors and devoted to exploring the many facets of those better years of our lives. The name of our program was inspired by a quotation from Robert Browning. "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be, the last of life for which the first was made." Now, sit back and enjoy a program made especially to provide seniors with useful information, plus some lighter moments to brighten your day.
Our guest was born in the state of Silesia in the eastern part of Germany on July 30th in 1939, the eve of World War II. In September, Germany invaded and occupied Poland, and that was the catalyst of World War II against the Western Allies. I'd like to introduce to you Franz Helbig. Franz, thank you for joining us for this program. We've been looking forward to it.
Good to be here.
Now, you were born in the town of Sagan in the state of Silesia, and that's a somewhat famous town that you wanted to tell us right off about this town.
That's right. In 1944 or 43, a nearby Sagan camp for Allied prisoners called Stalag Luft No. 3 experienced a massive escape. That escape was memorialized in the great movie 1963 with Steve McQueen, The Great Escape. And that was just a few miles from my house where I was born.
I've seen it many times. I wish I'd known you were from there when I saw the movie last.
Right.
And then there's also a wonderful book that you told me about, and I read. I loved it. Did you want to mention that?
Right. The reason I want to tell my story today, because I was very much inspired by a book by Wolfgang Samuel. It's called A German Boy, A Refugee Story. And the famous historian Stephen Ambrose wrote the introduction for this book. And this author was born in the same town, Sagan. He is the same age as I've talked to him, of course, and he portrays the story of a typical German boy. And that makes me want to tell that story here today.
Well, it was a beautiful book, and so I'm excited to hear your story. What was your life like? Now, you were born right on the eve, so you grew up in the war years.
That's right.
And what was your life in this town, your family, and what was all that background?
Well, my family, that is 3 other siblings, 2 sisters and 1 brother, and my mother lived there. My father was working in a local car dealership, and when the war broke out, September 1st, 1939, he was drafted as a lieutenant into the German army and took part in the Polish invasion. And after that, I saw almost nothing of him. So my mother took care of us during the war years when food and all other amenities became scarcer and scarcer.
And then you had, I think it was February 1945, you had an actual forced evacuation out of Sagan.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, was that all across Germany, the eastern part of Germany? Were you all evacuating at the same time, or was it this particular town?
I could maybe show on the basis of a map that all of eastern Germany here was being invaded by the Russian army, which came, of course, from Russia from the east. And as the Russian army advanced, the German population was or it was called evacuated. Actually, it was forced out.
Out of the whole
Out
region.
of the whole region. At the end, towards the end of 1945, about 16 million people had moved from far East Germany to East Germany and then to West Germany.
So how were these people notified that they had to evacuate?
Well, by...
Aside from the bombings and everything that would make them want to.
We could hear the very heavy Russian artillery for days and weeks before then, and we knew that the rumor mill during wartime is extremely active because people are very scared. And then I don't recall how the authorities forced us out, but we were put on trains. This is very, very cold winter of 1945, and the trains made their way towards the west. Many trains from Silesia went to Berlin. In fact, the author of the German boy book went to Berlin, and we were routed south towards Dresden and Czechoslovakia.
Now, when you got ready to leave, your father was gone, and your mother was there in Sagan with the 4 children. One was, I think the oldest was 10, you were 5. She had an 8-month-old baby. Was there any hysteria or anything getting ready, and did you take food, or how did all this come about?
I just reread the diary which my mother wrote from that day of when our flight started to the end when we ended up in West Germany, and she was totally in control. She was calm. She was most concerned about getting us packed up. We could only take with us what she and we, tiny children, could carry, so it was nothing, essentially. But Germans were very much used to hard times towards the end of the war, and she did a magnificent job, of course, in getting us through this horrendous time.
How did you get to the train station? Were the streets just filled with masses of people, and did you have to walk, I guess?
Yes, we walked to the train station, and the author of The German Boy describes the scene on the same platform, practically, where we were picked up by a train.
And the fights and struggles to get on the trains, and extremely crowded,
Right. The important thing to remember about the train is we were routed to Dresden, which is slightly to the south. Dresden, when we got there, many of the refugee trains went into the train station of Dresden, and on February 12th or 13th, 2 days after we left Sagan, Dresden experienced the great bombing by British and American bombers, which wiped out and killed probably 200,000 people. And many of the refugee trains from Silesia were caught in that awful bombing. We bypassed, I'm happy to say, Dresden, and saw Dresden burning on the horizon. And then we were routed to Czechoslovakia, which was occupied at the time by Germans.
Were you still on the same train when you were routed to
I don't remember that.
In other words, you weren't stranded somewhere in Germany before you got to Czechoslovakia?
I don't remember whether we changed trains, but I do remember that on the way, which took many days after that, after we left Dresden, we were strafed often by American fighter planes who thought, I presume, that we were some serious military transport, but the trains would stop and we would bail out of the train. And I remember after one of the attacks collecting shells that we played with, the cartridges. The cartridges.
Were you given food, or was all this happening so fast that...
it was, I don't know how we were fed, except I know one thing, that for this whole period, it took us 2 years to go from Sagan, East Germany, to Heidelberg, West Germany. It was a 2-year trek, and during that time we suffered greatly in terms of food and shelter and so on. It was just a horrendously bad time for us. But I wasn't alone. I was with millions and millions of other families who many suffered much more. We were lucky that we were not torn apart, that my mother kept us together, and that we survived the refugee camps in Czechoslovakia, where the Czechs, after the war ended, were not very happy to have us in their midst.
Well, let's see now. First the Germans government sent you to Czechoslovakia,
because it
where
was
you were in
German territory.
refugee camps.
Yes.
And then later the Americans came in under
Right.
General Patton's
That's right.
army. And I remember reading in some material you gave me that you all hung up white sheets
That's right.
on the outside of the surrender.
I was not amused, but I reflected very personally when I read about the American Liberator problem in Iraq, where we were maybe not welcomed so gladly, but I tell you, we were extraordinarily happy, ecstatic to be behind the American lines. It was the goal of our whole flight, of our trek. Unfortunately, Patton and his army, Third Army, pulled back when the Potsdam Conference was settled, the border of East Germany. So we were happy, and the first American soldiers we saw were on tanks, and they gave us chewing gum, and so that's when I met Americans for the first time.
Did you watch them rolling into the city, the
Yes.
long trains?
Yes,
and
we saw, and we put up. We had to put up white towels or sheets to indicate that we were at peace
Peaceful.
with them. We were.
I wanted to ask you what it was like under the Czechs when you were no longer refugees. You were interned by the Czechs in this
That's right.
camp. How were you treated by them?
We were treated badly. I must say that probably the Czechs suffered, of course, greatly under German occupation. So I understand fully how they must have felt, and the food supplies and all that was just as difficult for the Czechs as it were to us. But the hatred or the dislike of the Czechs towards the German was palpable, and we had a hard time staying alive there.
You were injured there?
Yes,
in the camp?
the
weren't you?
guards must have thought it was a joke, but they put ammunition into the little fires we built to cook a potato or something, and one of them exploded and hit me in the arm. But it wasn't as serious. We were evacuated again, shipped to East Germany, what became the German Democratic Republic.
So you're over in East Germany
Yes.
now, under the communist
Right.
regime. And then, what was your situation there? How were you transported there, and where did you live when you got there?
Right. We were transported by train again, and I think these were not these were covered trains, but freight trains. It was not very pleasant. We were assigned, the government somehow assigned refugees to private citizens, and they had to share houses. We were assigned to a farmer's house in a small village near the East-West German border. And we helped on the farm, and there the food began to be much better. We felt much better. It's also the first time I saw Russian soldiers, because it was occupied, the eastern zone was occupied by Russians, and we saw Russians many, many times. They were very kind to us children, but I saw them boisterous and wild in the farm. The farm had a small tavern, and the Russians frequented that, so that's how I experienced the Russians for the first time.
Eventually, you've been without your father all this time, and you really hadn't seen him much, had you? And then,
No, he was an officer in the German army, as I said, and he took part in various campaigns, including Russia, and he was very severely wounded in Russia, and then spent his time in training situations in Germany. And but my mother had lost touch with him, of course, during the last period of the war. And then through the Red Cross they found each other. He was in West Germany in the meantime, had been released there. He was an American prisoner of war for a while. He went to West Germany, and then through the Red Cross, he found out that we were in East Germany. And one day he walked into our little farm place there, and that's the first time I remember seeing him physically.
What excitement! What a
Yes, it was
thrill,
great.
was it?
Wonderful.
Did you just connect with him right away, or
I don't remember.
You don't remember.
He was
that.
pretty much a stranger at that time, of course.
And did he stay with you, or did he have to go back?
No, he visited another time or two maybe, and at that time he plotted with my mother to have us escape from East to West Germany, which was an illegal act, of course, already at that time, but the borders were not as heavily guarded as they were later.
I remember that you did it in the winter time. I know that he came to see you that summer, and then you waited until the cold, snowy winter to escape.
right.
Why? I'm kind of wondering why, because I noticed in the book of the German boy, they did that in the winter time.
Right.
They were there in the summer,
it
but
took-
they didn't go until winter.
Right. It took, there's nothing, we didn't pick the winter, but it took a long time to plan the escape. You had to do it secretly, of course, and sneak out of where you were, and you didn't tell anybody that you were leaving. I don't know how that was planned. It was just the first possible time to do that.
Did you have warm clothing? Or
No.
You didn't?
We were very cold.
But you made it over, and you called it the Iron Curtain. It was the dividing line between the East and West, and they called it...
That's right.
Well, it's Churchill who dubbed it the Iron Curtain.
That's right. In a famous speech in Missouri in 1946, he said that this border, which began to divide East and West Germany, East is over here, West is over here, this is the famous curtain that came down, as Churchill said, and it lasted until November of 1989, when the revolution, another revolution took place. So this is we were settled here in this area in East Germany, and we crossed this East-West German border. We snuck under the Iron Curtain, so to speak, at the end of 1946. And we moved to Heidelberg, because that was where my father was. Heidelberg was also the headquarters of the American Army in Europe. Eisenhower picked Heidelberg, a beautiful, beautiful city, as his headquarters. It still is today.
Oh, really? What was life then under the Americans? Because I'm kind of thinking, you know, they were your enemy for a while. How did it feel then to be rushing to go to the Americans?
Right. Not odd, but the overwhelming fact was that Americans were never perceived as evil, the evil enemy. The Russians were. I don't know what the feelings were about the French or the British. I suspect they were sort of like towards the Americans, but the Americans were the liberators, and the feelings were very positive from the beginning. There was no, the American zone, as that area was called, that the Americans occupied, was the most favorite place to live. It was where everybody wanted to be.
Where did you live in Heidelberg?
In the outskirts of Heidelberg, we rented a small two-room house where the 6 of us lived for many years, until 1955, actually. My father built a couple of small rooms, and we lived in relative poverty for 10 years after the war.
Is it just because you didn't have the money, or was it just food was not obtainable?
In the first years, food was extremely scarce. The first years, 47, was the worst winter in memory in Europe, and starvation was a huge, huge problem.
And what was life like in Heidelberg? Did you go to school? And
I started to go to school in Heidelberg. And
how did you react, the refugees coming into Heidelberg, the people who are already settled with
yes,
their homes
very
and
good.
everything?
Yes, the invasion, the large numbers of East Germans that came to West Germany, of course, caused huge problems in the West German native population, so to speak. The feelings were very negative in many, many places, and it's hard to imagine that this small area of Germany had so many different regional characteristics. The Prussians don't talk to the Bavarians, and the Swabians don't like the Hessians, and so on. And I recall that my parents asked us and insisted that we not pick up the local dialect. We spoke High German, what's called High German, a relatively accent-free German, and we were under great penalty not allowed to speak the local language, which of course caused a certain disaffection between us. As my school friends spoke a different dialect than I did, and that didn't help matters.
You went into America Haas, which is, can you explain what that is and
Right.
what the outcome of attending there was?
Yeah, America quickly installed public libraries. They were called America House, and they became very, very popular places because you could read books and see movies that they showed about America, and I went there while I was in the first years in high school in Germany, and there I saw that a competition was being held to select students to spend a year at a high school in the U.S. And I applied for that, and I asked my father, and he cackled and laughed and said, "Yeah, right. You're going to go to America. We were so poor." But I applied and came before a board, and I must have said the right things because I was selected to go and spend a year in Dallas, Texas.
Well, that must have been quite a change.
The most unusual aspect of the selection was that the person who chaired the small board was the daughter of Albert Speer. Albert Speer was one of the principals of Hitler's cabinet, so to speak. He was the chief architect and other things. And his son went to school with me, or I with him. And his daughter, his sister, was the one who, Albert Speer's daughter, senior daughter, helped select me to come to America. It's just a bizarre
It's amazing.
story.
It is, and the amazing thing is how they ended up over in the American sector, but that's another story, I'm
Yes.
sure. But you got to America, you loved it, you went back to Germany and decided you wanted to come to America, and at
To live
17 years old,
Yes.
you came.
Right. I applied for my own visa. I understand when I hear the immigration problems now that are being discussed, what a huge issue that is for families. We had nothing left in West Germany. We had lost everything. My family had nothing. So both my brother and I emigrated eventually. And when I started the visa application when I was 17 and got it, and I immigrated on my own, paid my own fare, worked at a factory in Germany. And I immigrated because I thought this is where I wanted to create my future. And I returned to the family where I was in Dallas, and then went to Texas Tech University, and later to University of Pennsylvania Graduate School.
I know you worked in the oil fields for a while,
That's
putting
right.
your way through school. And then, what about the military? You have quite an amazing military career.
Right. Many of my male relatives in Germany had been officers in the German army, so the military tradition was very natural to me, and I wanted to serve. Unfortunately, I was drafted before I could become an officer, and I was not a citizen. You have to be a citizen to be an officer, but you may serve.
You can be drafted, but not
as a non-citizen. So eventually I became an officer anyway, and I spent a couple of wonderful years at the Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And one time I flew as an officer. I accompanied some atomic weapons shipments to Germany, and I visited in full U.S. Army lieutenant uniform an uncle of mine who was a major general in the German army, retired of course. He was delighted to see me.
I can well imagine. Well, I know that you also were jumping from planes. You must have been a paratrooper.
That's right. I didn't get enough excitement. I would have served in Vietnam, but my number didn't come up. It was during that time. So I volunteered to do high altitude jumping, what's called free falling at the time. It's now called other things. But I did that as a volunteer and eventually taught other officers and enlisted people to jump out of planes at great height.
Well, you've had a lot of wonderful positions, occupations, and I know that you work for U.S. companies in Europe and Germany, yes. And you had some really interesting experiences. If you can very quickly tell us what they are.
I worked in Europe for more than a decade for different companies, especially Johnson & Johnson, and while living in Berlin, in the late 80s, I was invited as a member of the American business community there to be in a small group of people who were seated in front of the wall in Berlin when President Reagan was there and gave a few feet from us his famous speech where he asked Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Mm-hmm. And we were right there. My wife then and children were with me. And it was an exhilarating moment to have been there at that time.
That must have meant a lot more to you than some of the other people there.
Yes, right. The feelings that we have about the East-West situation, of course, is very, very deep. And many of my American friends really had a hard time understanding what this complicated issue with Berlin was and so on. I was also there helped my children, my two daughters, climb up on the wall when it was being torn down, or when people started to chisel away at it. Their boyfriends put them up on the top of the wall, and we have some pictures of them. And we were there when the wall was breached for the first time. Oh. And we walked through the wall.
Oh my
and walked through the Brandenburg Gate, which before then was no man's land. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful day in 1989.
Well, I'm glad you got to be there for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad you made it to America. It appears through all your professional endeavors and your military experience that you've contributed to America. Well, thanks so much for coming and talking with us, Franz. We're so happy you joined us, and if you would like to purchase a copy of this program or any of our other programs, you can contact us through the Cupertino Senior Center. That number is 777-3150. Again, it's 408-777-3150. We also have a website. It's www.thebetterpart.com. Thanks again. We hope to see you next time.